So, theologically speaking,
Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Leon Henderson, and I'm here again with Father Ian Elliott Davis. Hello.
hello, good to see you again.
Great to see you. Today is an episode that I'm a little nervous about just because you had told me about a month and a half ago you wanted to do this episode of the theology of suffering. Mm-hmm. And then just to kind of go straight into it, my father passed away.
Yes.
So I'm like, okay, so when your parent dies, you need to meet with your priest and kind of really do that. So here we are. It became something different for me. And I'm actually really excited about this episode. So,
Well, I'm nervous.
Are you?
I am, because it's raw. It's very raw. And I feel I don't want to intrude in any way, shape, or form.
And because as people know, I'm a podcaster. I have another show other than this. It's just my personal ramblings, and I use it as just something to explore what I'm going through and maybe inspire others. And that's why I'm excited about it, because it might get raw for me, and there might be somebody out there who needs to hear it, because right. COVID-19 is happening in 2020, yes. And a lot of people have lost people in 2020, so this might be the most pertinent episode we've done. So I say we just get right into it. What do you think?
Sure.
So what do you mean when you say the theology of suffering?
Suffering at root is about the human condition. It's about facing up to the reality of who and what we are, our finite nature. We are not infinite, however much we may want to be infinite. We are limited, and we come up hard against questions in life. Grief and bereavement being those that are most to the fore in my mind as we talk today.
And that was something I wanted to circle back with, because I don't want this to be the theology of grief and the theology of bereavement. Right. It just happens to be that I am going through the suffering of grief right now. So I'm able to speak on a first-person perspective of suffering. But when you say suffering, what are other ways that people may be suffering that they can lean into their theology with that?
I think any kind of diminishing of who we are and what we are.
Maybe like if you had a job that sort of defined you and you lost your job, or you lost a child, or a divorce.
Yes, or an illness, or some...
Which you can speak on that too.
Sure.
An illness that you've come through.
Yes, I stared the intensive care unit in the face for 3 days down at Cedars-Sinai.
Yeah.
And that was a fairly scary kind of experience to go through that. But suffering is any diminishing, any form of life or negation of life, of the life force or the divine. Suffering is not intrinsic to the Christian faith. It's not the case that, if I'm going to be a Christian, then I've got to just battle it out and be as tough as I can. But suffering is something that's a lot more subtle, a lot more to do with maturity and growing and growth, as well as diminishing. So as certain areas and aspects of our life, for me I had cancer. It was realizing that this was possibly going to be the end of the line for me. And the first kind of consequence of that was I was thinking, I'm letting my parents down. How stupid could one be than to die on one's parents? And I had a brother who died 6 years ago. So my parents have already been through that grief and that suffering. And so there was an added weight when I became ill. I didn't want them to be left, is the bottom line. I've always had issues with separation anxiety and being left and being alone, and the idea of me leaving my parents and them being on their own filled me with horror.
That was something I went through a little bit. I mean, it's not the same,
Right.
Going back to Alabama and leaving my family after my father's funeral and coming back here to live my life in LA, that sadness of just like, will everybody be okay without me there? But something that tickled me this morning, I was thinking about it as I was getting ready. I was so angry that I had grown so much in the last month. Because this suffering, you're like, it's got to be like the grief and the sadness and the depression that came with my father passing. So much has happened that made me grow as a person and made me stronger and made my faith deeper. And I was like, good Lord. I was like, of course this would all have a point, wouldn't it? Because,
I'm
you know what I mean?
glad
It's like, I guess that's such a weird way of looking at it, but I'm like, I guess, God, you're teaching me something. You got to make me sad as I could be to teach me all I know, but.
Well, I'm glad you were angry about that, because if you were content with that, I'd be I would then be angry with you, actually, because I don't believe that suffering is a God inspired movement to teach us how to be better.
Yeah.
The reducing human beings to being laboratory animals in a way fills me with horror as well. The idea that we are nothing but rats in a kind of one of those complicated, if you push one pedal you get rat poison, if you push the other pedal you get water or whatever.
Trying to find the cheese here.
Right, trying to find cheese. Yes.
Well, did you grow? Did you find that you were a priest when you got cancer?
Right.
It was last year.
Right, yeah.
So you had a deep grasp on the theology and the spirituality and everything. Were you put in a place where you learned more about yourself through that?
Yes, I did learn more about myself, and I learned how limited I could be and how ultimately so many of the things that I'd thought were important before were actually unimportant and of passing value.
Yeah.
And the reality of life is that family, they're there. Blood is thicker than water. Friends, they show their worth or their worthlessness when they are or are not there.
Did you have that? I mean, not to speak at all on any of it, but you had people who just did not show up.
And surprisingly, it was some of my least Christian, if you like, my least religious friends who actually turned around and were there and came and saw me in hospital. And I don't know, there was something gutsy and harsh about being in the ward down at Cedars-Sinai and going every day and having radiation and seeing people who, some were just beginning, some were halfway through, some were finishing. And I was just starting out. And my surgeon was amazingly encouraging and bright and wonderful, a young guy with a family. And he kept me hard at the radiation. He said, you can't just take a couple of days off halfway through because you're feeling depressed or down. he described it. He said, your cancer is like a nest of hornets, if you like, and you've walloped it a couple of times with radiation. They're really angry now, and you need to carry on the treatment, otherwise they're going to sting the hell out of you.
You got to get them.
Excuse my language, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Did you find that you wanted to, after your radiation, to just pick up and keep going, just to carry on with your normal tasks?
Reading books. Suddenly books have become just crucial for me. And I went through a period where I said to myself, what am I going to leave behind? What will be left of me when I've gone?
Yeah.
What will be worthwhile? And there's not a great deal, but there are a few bits and pieces, and books I hope that people will value and cherish, and
Yeah, I've been grappling with through the grief process, because I was saying just as we were getting started, you hear all these, I call them the Oprah people who can tell you, the psychology of it and the spirituality of it, of that grief will just show up in the weirdest of ways and make you angry for nothing. And, and I'm like, I got it. We'll be sad. I'll pray about it and then I'll move on. And it's been a month since Dad has passed, and it's been hard to grapple with and stuff. But that leads me to my next question. Theologically speaking, what do people do with suffering? What do they do when you're traveling the path of Christianity? You do your prayers and you do your thing, but then you hit that brick wall of suffering. I
think that's it. You persist. You stick at it. The simple, ordinary, down-to-earth stuff, saying the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, just those simple phrases, they kind of come home. I remember when there was a very holy and devout priest called Basil Hume, who was a Benedictine monk. He actually achieved kind of a very senior position in the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales. He was diagnosed with cancer and he was dying, and I remember his meditations that he offered day by day on the Lord's Prayer were some of the most moving and profound thoughts that I've ever heard, and not complicated, not intellectual, but weighty and full of meaning and bathos, deep bathos indeed.
And what is bathos?
The depth of the. Sorry, when I say bathos, maybe I've got the wrong word. I mean it's full of meaning, of depth, of weight, really. That's what I mean. It might mean the opposite, actually, now I think of it. Bathos might mean empty.
Really?
Yes. It's strange. There are words in the English language, like we were talking the other day. Cleave is another one. Can mean the exact opposite. To cleave can mean to cut apart, but it can also mean to join together. And cleave. Cleavage can be the separation, but also the joining. Yes. Sorry, now you've gone bright red. I have to tell.
You always do something
I have to
that
tell
no one will ever
listeners.
see.
You've gone so red.
It's the Fanta.
It was the cleavage.
But you were saying that it's simple, but full of bathos.
Right.
Do you find that's where it starts? The quiet, the simple, the still, when you're in suffering? That's
when it comes home to one, I think. That's when it's hit me. When my brother died, I said to myself, "Oh, you're a priest. You can take this. You're big enough to cope with this," and I was okay for about 2 minutes with that reassurance, and then I realized the impact of my brother's death on my parents, and that's when it walloped me like the brick wall.
Yeah.
One just has to wait.
And that's what happened to me too. Dad was sick. It wasn't COVID, but he was sick, and the last 12 hours of his life were pretty excruciating for him. And we were all with him when he died, and it was, and then and we were just praying for relief for him. And so for the first 2 weeks, I was at peace with everything because he wasn't in pain anymore.
Right.
And then you realize after 2 weeks, he's still gone. And then you realize, oh, he's never coming back.
Right.
And then you realize, oh, wow, everything's different forever. So I guess with our similarities, we always seem to find our similarities in ways like that. Is the goal of the theology of suffering to find your way out of suffering?
There's no guarantee of that, which sounds a bit depressing. But depression plays a part in suffering as well, and realizing the harsh reality. There's humor as well, I think.
And I think you and I both are the type of people that we find comfort in finding the humor in the just terrible.
Yes. Some of the most humorous and vivacious people I know are funeral directors, because they live with death. That's their job in trade, and they are so close to death all the time. When clergy and funeral directors get together, they're fantastic lunchtime conversations. They are just full of fun.
I did just about an hour after Dad had passed. He was at home. We were waiting on the funeral. We had to wait on the hospice nurse. Then we had to wait on the funeral home. Then we had, so there was a lot of waiting, but we had 12 hours of crying and holding hands and keeping him cool and just exhaustion of taking care of somebody as they transitioned to that space. And about an hour after he had passed, I got so giggly. And I could not help it. And everybody was so uncomfortable with me. And my aunt would say something, and I had to stifle the laugh. And then somebody else would say something. And, of course, everybody would kind of laugh with me. And then the moment would be over. But then I would still be shaking the couch, just shaking with laughter over something they said. And I said, I don't know what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening. I'm so sorry. This is not appropriate. Because Dad is still laying here in the house waiting for someone to come pick him up. And I can't stop laughing. No. So is that a good thing?
Yes.
To find the joy in the pain?
Well, the way the human mind works is beyond any reasonable kind of way of understanding. I think there can be a situation where things become so intense that the only way to release that is through laughter, seeing the comical in a situation. And even if that becomes inappropriate, sometimes that's exactly what a family needs. They need to realize this is a terribly sad situation, but there is another side to it, and that life for them goes on, albeit in a diminished way, as I said earlier. But I think humour is vital. A friend of mine, Michael Screech in London.
What a great name.
Yes, he wrote a book called Laughter at the Foot of the Cross.
Oh my gosh, I want to read that now.
Yeah. He's a professor of French in Oxford.
There's another book that I'd read a few years ago that I really liked. It was called Between Heaven and Mirth.
Oh,
And
that's
I really
inventive.
am so fascinated by the joy and the laughter in Christianity. So
It's a subject. The comical and the tragic are two kind of different sides of the same coin, I think, in lots of ways.
do you find that during suffering, people that are looking to use their theology and their spirituality to not even bring them out of it, but to navigate it, do you find that they have to have joy to find success?
I don't know that joy and success necessarily go together.
I guess success in navigating the grief or the
right.
suffering. Do they navigate it better when they have joy and laughter?
Yes, I think to contrasting those and seeing where it's appropriate and where it's inappropriate to be terribly morbid and dark and kind of lost, then it's those are tragic moments. But then there are also occasions where the humorous does break through, and we've got to laugh, we've got to smile. I think they say in Greek, don't they? Smiling through the tears.
Is that Greek?
Da krueon galasasa.
I feel like I'm Southern, so I feel like that's a very Southern thing too.
Well, it shows the
but who
influence
knows? I
of
mean, it might have started in Greece.
the influence of the Athenian Empire on Georgia and Alabama.
Back in
and
Bug Tussle.
Bug Tussle. Bug Tussle. Oh, tell me, in Bug Tussle, was the funeral a big event?
It wasn't a big event, and I will say, in Alabama, they are a lot more lax about COVID and everything. My father's funeral was not terribly large, but we did have people there. Like it was a normal funeral. There were singers. There was 2 preachers. Everybody wore their masks in the church. And yeah, actually something that was very spiritual to me in the South, where I'm from. You know, you bury the dead in a cemetery, and where my dad went to church, there's a cemetery there, and he was buried there. But normally now, the people who dig the grave, or the funeral director recruits someone to dig up the grave and then bury them. My brother-in-law actually dug the grave himself with his own equipment, and then I was the first person to pick up a shovel and start burying my father. After he was lowered into the ground. So we did it felt very pastoral to me.
Yes. Yeah.
To just have the men of the family picking up shovels and burying my father. And so it was very intimate, but it was what we would have had if COVID wasn't a thing. But Mom did call me the other day and she said, "I'm so glad." And I said, "What?" And she said, "No, there hasn't been a case of COVID for anybody who came to the funeral." Wow. And then she said, somebody's name that I won't say, but she said, "So-and-so died the other day and 12 people got COVID from his funeral." Oh, good Lord. So I was like, and she goes, "So I feel like we did good."
Right.
And I said, "We sure did."
Yeah.
So it was hard, but I am grateful that I was able to have that. And I know that there were so many who wasn't. And I know that that's probably a big source of suffering for people, that they didn't get to have that final space as much as they did. But it was a small country church with mostly people who live around each other. So it was a bit of a risk, I think, for sure. But I'll be grateful.
It sounds very much that it was a community event as well in some ways.
Yeah.
Which my home town in Wales, it would be very much a community event.
Well, I mean, it was one of the preachers was a Baptist preacher who was friends with Dad and was drafted to Vietnam with Dad. And he told the story of how he and Dad got arrested for the first time together. So very Southern. But yeah, it was nice, and that part gave me a lot of peace. And like you said, it soothes you for a moment. and then you have to deal with the real life, what's left behind. So anybody suffering or anything, what would you say? Where do you start?
Where does one?
Yeah, like if you need something more than just you need something more. I don't know. I guess theologically sound for your exact.
Start where you
suffering.
are. Reorient yourself. Reassess where one is, and it's like cartography, finding oneself on a map, and try and see the perspective, try and see the contours of the land, the shape of the surrounding terrain, and just try and assess where one is. And then one can move if one desires to move.
I will say that I don't know if it's just the cadence with which you say things, but that's what I've known because I'm an Episcopalian. I go to church. I know that and I watch Oprah all the time, so I know this is true. But sometimes you just need to hear it, and I think that's important. And what would you say that it is? Is it important to do anything specific with study or with prayer or with anything like that, or is
Feel it? I should say that probably one of the most formative and crucial books for understanding the whole subject of suffering, theologically speaking, is in the 20th century Jürgen Moltmann's volume. Jürgen Moltmann, Moltmann, is a German theologian. The Crucified God, that came out in the I will tell you now, in the 1970s, came out in 1973, in fact, and translated into English. And the Crucified God, it speaks about how God, in fact, identifies with suffering and experiences. Now, this is where language starts to become problematic, because to say that God suffers is something that Christians have avoided saying, because to suffer can mean to change, and God is supposed to be unchanging. So therefore, God is not able to suffer. Now, even that sounds a bit peculiar, to say that God is not able to do something.
It reminds me of this old hymn that we'd sang in the church, "Oh, to God's unchanging hand."
Right.
I remember that.
I don't know that one. Is that from the Baptist hymnal?
It was in the Church of Christ hymnal.
Oh, right.
So,
Okay, right.
But I think the Baptists sing it too. But yeah, it's interesting that it just further proves your point that people think he's unchanging. He's not capable of suffering.
Well, the Crucified God, and also a movement called process theology. When I was a young student, these had a profound impact on me, because they loosened up the language, the grammar of theology for me. They kind of made it more attainable, a language that I could speak, could understand and comprehend.
Would it be appropriate to make connections of our own suffering to the suffering that Christ suffered on the cross?
I think we have to. For Christians, that's an absolutely crucial, forgive the pun, that's a crucial connection that must be made. Because to see into the heart of God is to see Calvary, to see what redemption can mean, to see the worst that human nature can throw at God, the worst that we can contemplate, and to see how God takes that into his being and transmutes and transforms death into life. That's, for me, what the hope of in the midst of suffering, what the Christian hope is, that there is life in spite of all the wickedness and the suffering and the pain and the fragility that is around. And there are, there are shades, very subtle shades, in the whole subject of theologically talking about suffering, that I want to explore, I think, launching off from Jürgen Moltmann's The Crucified God. He gave some lectures at Westminster Abbey not so long ago, and I need to catch up with those and find out what his latest thinking is. And he's still alive. He is. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I mean, what you just said, it really resonates with me. It made me realize that theology and God is at the very core of my own suffering and grief. In a way that I knew that I'm a Christian. I knew that I'm going through something, so I need to use my faith to get through it. But I didn't realize till this moment the grief is my faith. If that makes sense. And that's what you made me realize, that this is you say you have principles, but then when you're out of the frying pan and into the fire, you kind of give up your principles and do what you got to do to get through it. This is the time to really put your money where your mouth is, put your heart where your soul is, and be a Christian to get yourself through the suffering. And not get yourself through it. Let God do it.
And God will. God is more than capable of carrying us. And there's that awful poster, the footprints on the beach, which I can't stand. It makes me absolutely furious. the two sets of footprints, and then it's the one set of footprints, and the person gets angry and says, where were you when I was at my worst, when I was suffering? Look, there's only one set. And God says, I was carrying you. Those aren't your footprints, those are mine. And there is something very profound about that we are carried in the heart of God. For me, it's the Sacred Heart of Christ and the Immaculate Heart of Mary are what... that's the way my religious language comes out, I suppose, the way I would express it. But the depth echoes depth, and I think when one hears the depth of someone's experience, one intuitively knows, and God intuitively knows about our suffering as well.
And it's, just to piggyback off that, it's so interesting the way that I have felt how God has shown up. Like, you took that ugliness and just turned it into something that taught me everything I needed to know in that moment.
Wow.
And it's like, wow. That's what I meant by this morning. I'm like, everything that I'm hating right now is something God's teaching me for. And it's, I'm growing like crazy.
How old are you?
33.
Because I think you're like 24 or something like that.
It's because my partner's an esthetician.
That's
I got taut skin.
Can he do anything for me?
No. He is a magician.
I'm 56 years of age.
Well, you don't look a day over 55.
Thank you very much. That's so kind. Yes.
But I think that is, I feel like that is no better place than there to stop.
Right.
And just see how the people might think. But is there any kind of resources, or just like the book, the Crucified God?
The Crucified God.
That's one. Is there anything else that anybody going through something should read?
Talk to your priest if you're able to.
What if we have listeners who don't have a priest?
Talk to a trusted friend that you've known for some time who's wise. and is able to cope, able to carry, because it can be a burden.
Well, you got to strike when the iron is hot, right?
Well, I've got a poem. I was going to read a poem by
Oh, you have
George
a poem?
Herbert.
I would love to hear it, if you don't mind that it might make me cry.
It's called The Agony. And George Herbert was a Welshman and a metaphysical poet. Philosophers have measured mountains, fathomed the depths of seas, of states and kings, walked with a staff to heaven, and traced fountains. But there are two vast, spacious things, the which to measure it doth more behove, yet few there are that sound them, sin and love. Who would know sin, let him repair unto Mount Olivet. There shall he see a man so wrung with pains that all his hair, his skin, his garments bloody be. Sin is that press and vice which forceth pain to hunt his cruel food through every vein. Who knows not love? Let him assay and taste that juice which on the cross a pike did set again a broach. Then let him say if ever he did taste the like. Love is that liquor sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I as wine.
That's beautiful.
That says everything.
That says it all.
Really. We experience it as wine. God, it's God's blood.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cross, and exactly what you've just been saying.
Yeah. I mean, I can't think of anything more profound than those words. So I think that's a beautiful place to end. Theologically Speaking is a production of Church Nerds Productions. Executive producers for the show are Jeffrey Clark Tosca, Father Ian Elliott Davis, and Kyle Leon Henderson. Associate producer is Ed Tosca. Editors for the show are Kyle Leon Henderson and Jeffrey Clark Tosca. Music for this program is provided by Dr. Jeffrey Parola and the choir at St. Thomas the Apostle Hollywood. We would also like to give a special thanks to Louie for all the loving licks on the knee under the table while we produce this show. Visit St. Thomas the Apostle Hollywood Facebook page for more information on the show, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram at St. Thomas Hollywood.